How to embrace the local in a post-COVID world. Hi, my name is Marcin Wojciech-Żebrowski, and this is the newest episode of Urbcast, my podcast about urbanism, cities, architecture, and many more. Keep this introduction very short today, as I have an extremely interesting conversation to share with you. And this time I talked to Liselott Stenfeldt, who is the Director of Innovation at GEHL Architects. I assume that if you are listening to this podcast, you know very well who GEHL Architects are. But if you don't know, I just wanted to explain very quickly that GEHL is a global leader in people-centered urban design, with studios in Copenhagen, New York, and San Francisco, who are making cities for people. GEHL Architects was founded in year 2000 by Professor Jan GEHL and urban designer Hele Soholt as the continuation of GEHL's research within the area over the past 4 decades. Jan GEHL himself is a Danish-based architect and urban designer who over the years, over actually the decades of his research and observing the public life together with his wife, created this extremely interesting design approach, which is putting the people in the center of the design and is focusing on designing the people-friendly spaces. Coming back to the topic of today's episode, I will be focusing on gaining the deeper understandings of people's needs and behavior after and during the pandemic. And we will focus not only on the new appreciation and new love for the local, but also we will talk about the studies of the sound. We will talk about the importance of looking at the soundscape in our cities. So we will talk about the city at the ear level. A couple of months ago, Liselott, together with researchers from Aarhus University in Denmark, wrote a very interesting paper pointing at the importance of bringing more nuances to the discussion about sound in the cities. We are talking about the importance of taking into consideration the qualitative data about sound in our cities, because it's not only about the noise, it is about many more. We also focused on embracing the local, something that GEHL Architects and Liselott are very good at. So I just wanted to invite you to the newest episode of Urbcast. Welcome to the new episode of Urbcast, and I'm very happy, Liselott, that we can meet finally.
Yeah, it's been taking some time, but here we are.
It's been a long time, but I'm happy that we can discuss the new scope on sound of GEHL Architects, and not only, we will and just come to that as well. But first, I just wanted to introduce you to the listeners, and I think that maybe it will be the best if you do it yourselves.
Well, I work as a director in GEHL, where I focus very much on research and development and how we can actually have both new approaches, but also develop new tools, digital tools, but also tools in general that can help us actually focus on the new aspects of the future cities that we're all being confronted with in this complex world.
I assume that the office and the work was influenced by COVID. And of course, it's a thing that many offices are talking about. It also is reflected in how we design our cities nowadays, I think. But since you are closely monitoring, researching the public life of cities, I'm extremely curious how it was in your case. What was the influence of pandemic on your working methodology, on your tools, and how did it change the way you work in general?
Well, there was a lot of changes. You could almost talk about a historical moment in life where we got the opportunity to actually look at the city from a very, very basic point of view. Like the shops were closed, the restaurants were closed, the cafes were closed. And what actually did encourage and discourage people in this time. And that affected the way we use our tools and methods. Even though it's the same values, it's still the 12 quality criteria, which is very old take on this urban planning that we still, of course, use. But this looking into cities, very qualitative and a bit more local, and not being able to be there. That's a dilemma that is really special. I mean, GEHL is a company that has traveled a lot. We always travel out to the cities we work with to observe it. But what do you do when you can't travel? So this, of course, put extra pressure on things that was already in development, but it put extra pressure on how we collect data, how we filter and store data, and how we communicate data. What platforms do we use when we can't go out and talk about it? And it also made us think very much about other aspects in our tools that has always been there. I think many architect companies or companies in general recognize this. It's not like it's a new thing, but it got accelerated to start talking about, for example, data ethics in a new way. What do we do all of a sudden with this kind of ownership to data? How do you get consent when you do it online? How do you include everyone? Like, how do you make sure that it's still diverse, what you're working with? When you, for example, collect big data online, like how can you make sure that all the data you are gathering is actually living up to the values and standard of the company? So it has both been development of tools, but also refining tools and asking these questions. How do we include people using online tools?
When I first heard your presentation, I think it was beginning of 2021, maybe.
I think so.
If I'm right. And you've been also presenting this report, Public Space, Public Life, when you've been researching for Danish cities of Copenhagen, Horsens, Helsingør, and Svendborg. And when I first saw this publication, this report, I was wondering, how did you manage to research and to talk to people in the midst of the pandemic, where we suddenly got this strange feeling of lack of trust kind of in this public space, right? Like people just not trusting each other and asking each other to just step away and leave some room on the street. So how did you manage to talk to people, to research that in these strange times?
Well, it's a very good and fair question to ask, especially how do you interview people with 2 meters between? That's difficult. No, we actually started to use different digital online tools. Among others, we used a tool called Maptionnaire that we had quite a good success with using, which is online, but you can actually also gather data as you go out in the city. So people can actually get access to this online platform wherever they are, like with all web-based tools, of course. So we used this, and then we were so lucky to be able to use that. We have a big network. We have a lot of people. We have collaborated with so many universities and schools and cities around the world that we could actually have people help us in the cities we worked with, which was amazing because we worked in San Francisco, we worked in New York, we worked in Lima, Bogota, Recife. We have really been doing these studies around the world, and we feel truly grateful that we had people that helped us. And again, we had a tool, we have an app, and so they could actually use this app and gathered the data so that it came in in our language. So we could actually filter the data and make conclusions and ask questions based on this. So it's been a truly collaborative and collective thing. So we should actually credit all our great people in the network for helping. But I think at the same time as there were mistrust, like you're saying, or that people were afraid, maybe, there were also this need to care for each other. And people have kind of developed this kind of care for the community, which I think was kind of amazing to experience, that people needed to understand what was going on and they needed to be a part of figuring out how to live this new life and this new normal that I guess we all have questioned 10 times. Is this the new normal? Oh, no, it wasn't. Is this the new normal? And so I think we really had a good experience there. I think you could almost talk about a care revolution out there. People are caring a bit more about each other, about the community, and about the cities they live in.
You mentioned the digital tools, and of course they are extremely helpful. They are nowadays, I think, irreplaceable because they are just a part of our daily work, especially if you design and in architecture. But there's this flip side of it, this drawback that it is a bit excluding. Would you agree that actually not everyone can access such digital tools.
Yeah, it's true. And I think that's also one of the challenges I see when we use more participatory, like where we try to involve citizens. It can be a challenge who you actually reach out to by using digital tools. When that's being said, you're actually reaching out to another group than you would have done if it was these kind of hearings or kind of these meetings that people show up to, which is also interesting to discuss because you actually can reach out to a younger group of people. Often, you can often reach out to people that don't come because they're not from the country and don't feel included in the same way. So you actually reach out to other groups than you would if it was physical, because that can also be excluding, to be honest. When that's being said, you could say that the core tool GEHL uses is very much about observing. So the tool we have, the app, or what we call the GEHL lens, is observing. So the tool that we have the ambassadors out in the city using is something that helps you observe who is using the city. Who are they together with? Are they in groups? Are they keeping a distance or not? Like, we had a lot of these parameters that were also like added because of COVID. Did they have mask or did they not have mask? And so all of this we added in the app so that the people that helped us in our network could actually observe for us, but using this matrix that made it very like objective for them to use. So in other words, they were actually looking what was going on in a public space. And in other words, everyone that was using that public space got involved. And then you can always use that data to say who was not there. And then when you put that together with data about the city, like how many people in this age group lives there, how many people from another country has moved here, or, all of this, if you start to look at that, you can actually say, okay, how big percentage of this group were using the space, and then conclude who was not there. So I feel the way we're working is still very inclusive because it's not only reaching out and asking questions.
I remember when reading the report that you've observed actually a handful of very interesting things. And one of them was that, especially here in Denmark, the public spaces, they kind of became more lively. And especially the elderly and children started using these places. And I think it's just very interesting to observe and compare with different countries, because I've heard that in my home country of Poland, there were even restrictions about the access to public greenery. So I think that was like a very bad decision that the access to the forest was restricted and people basically were forced to stay at home or just walk around their block. Whereas here in Denmark, or especially in Copenhagen, because this is the city where I experienced that, everything was opened and people were even encouraged to go out.
Yeah, I think it's a huge difference. I also have family in the States, and they had people living in New York, and they were saying like, oh my God, we're sitting in with their kids. The parks were closed. They're like privately owned parks, and they were closed to not be responsible for spreading COVID. And I think it just made me feel so lucky that like Scandinavia and Denmark and, as you say, Copenhagen in this case, it just had this kind of, well, people need to stay healthy. People need to go out, both to stay sane, to be honest, to get out of the apartments.
Exactly. It's about mental health.
Yeah, exactly. Mental health, but also physical. I mean, in cities like Copenhagen that are kind of dense and, to be honest, also quite expensive per square meters, it's so important that everyone has access to green space. I would say it's never been more clear how important it is with open space, green space. And it was interesting to see how people were also using green space outside of the city. People were really, really just hungry for getting out, and including myself. So I totally get the feeling. And yes, it was so inspiring to see how a lot of elderly people, more than we registered before, used green space and outdoor area, and small kids. You could say small kids, that makes more sense because they were home from school. There's another kind of, but the interesting part was that when it reopened, there were just as many kids out. And I think that's also interesting that, so there was a newfound love for this local neighborhood. There were 80% decrease of pedestrian flow in the city center, but there were 20% going up, at least in Amager and Vesterbro and Nørrebro and further out. So this was a super interesting thing that we registered, I feel.
let's just talk about this new law for the local. You mentioned that the local neighborhood just got a lot of attention. And I think that it was rediscovered. And this is something that actually, as I also observed in different countries, was kind of found as well. Again, in my home country as well, I heard about people discovering their own neighborhood, getting to know their neighbors. And feeling that the place they live, it is something that they are closely attached to.
Absolutely.
How did you observe the birth of the new localhood?
Well, I think when we started to realize how much more pedestrian flow there was in the local neighborhoods, we actually made a new phase of the project where we only focused on selected local neighborhoods. And I think it was very interesting to see that in areas where there were a mix of amenities and where there were both like activities offered from the city, like playgrounds, parks that was like hosted by the city, combined with some cafes or some offers, some street food, as long as there were like mix of these amenities and offers, it really thrived. Like people were really thriving in these areas. It was like, it was a new city almost. Like Nabu, where I lived, was like, it was so great to come out and you were like really enjoying it. And it felt like summer started so much before because you got out. Yes, it was cold, but there was a very good community feeling, I felt. And I think going back to this care revolution I talked about, there's actually this super inspiring researcher from the University of Texas, Rush Patel, and he talks very much about this care revolution, like how we have started to see the people behind the systems all of a sudden. We have been sitting at home, ordering things online, things have been delayed, things have not worked, transportation has there are still trains that doesn't go because there's no one to drive the trains. And that creates an awareness. And this awareness that it's actually people behind the system. I mean, it makes sense. Of course there is. But I feel like the logistic and all of this have worked so well before. And I don't think we have felt the need to ask who is behind all of this. And no one have asked like, oh, so what does it mean that this new shoes can be delivered next day? Does that mean that there's someone that works 12 hours instead of 8? And, all of these questions, I feel they have been asked more. And I think this care for people and for us has become very, very strong during COVID. And I think that's actually finding some positive outcomes. This is a really positive outcome because I think hopefully it could last, that we remember that there are like people behind it. So in other words, there's also people behind the local kiosk. There's also a person in the restaurants. There's also someone owning the cafe. You want to support local cafes and local shop. So there's something there. And I think this love and care for the community has grown huge.
I think that Copenhagen is especially good at being local. And here I mean that there are many local stores that are only located in this one place, in this one district. There are not many chains. For example, coffee places. You can't see many Starbucks or many other coffee chains. So you feel more attached to this, your own local coffee place that you love to support.
Exactly.
So do you think that we kind of realized and learned that if we don't support this local neighborhood, it will not be the same as we...
I think so. I think it has become, also seeing like some of my friends having cafes, they have struggled so hard. And, and then you start to also see how much they're struggling to stay there. And I think somehow, it's actually something we're looking into right now because I don't have the answer, but it is interesting to see who are the key stakeholders in a street. Like, if this shop closes, will that be the death of the streets? How many are like the key stakeholder of a street? And would a street with only chain stores, would that actually survive? Or would people just feel like, well, that's Starbucks will probably survive anyway, I don't need to support it? Or there's something very interesting with that is pointing at the balance of a like healthy and sustainable street. So it's actually something we are looking into and trying to figure out, like, how can we map this? How can we figure out what kind of phenomenon is behind how a good city works? A good example is Køge. We hear so much about Køge being a very good Danish small city that is just working. Why? Like, it's just so interesting. So yeah, it's an area that is full of interest from our side.
You are very enthusiastic when you talk about these observations, and I had the same. And I need to say that, of course, the pandemic itself, it was like a tragic thing that happened. But to us urbanists, designers, and especially for GEHL architects, it was like the best time to study public life. It was like a life laboratory.
Yeah. I mean, it's of course a double-sided feeling, because of course it started off being a real like crisis almost, because how do you survive as a urban consultancy that usually travels all the time when you can't travel? Or travel, it's not only the travel part, but studying cities, and when they're all empty, what are you working on? Like, what are you doing? And I think all of a sudden, like when we then got the opportunity together with Realdania and the city of Copenhagen to actually do this and to actually go out and study public life, then you're right. It was this kind of like, wow, we're actually seeing the city for what it is. We're seeing how it's visually, like how it's looking. We're like, there were so many layers that came out because the traffic has stopped and, you know, the shop were closed and people were just out thriving, using the park. And why did they go to the park? Like there were so many other questions that we normally would ask, but wouldn't see in the same way, I think.
One more thing is extremely interesting, and it's kind of new, is to talk about the sound environment and the soundscape of our cities, especially in the midst of the pandemic, but also let's call it after, because like we are talking in the times, it's actually the beginning of February, but since the beginning of February, all the restrictions in Copenhagen and in Denmark were cancelled. So we kind of can say that we are in a restriction-free country. And that's especially interesting to me to talk about this sound environment. And this is something that we also talked about while preparing for this conversation. You have recently, together with researchers from Aarhus University, wrote a very interesting article, The City at the Ear Level, and talking about the necessity of talking about the qualitative studies of sound. Can you just introduce this idea of studying the sound environment?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an area that I find incredible, relevant, and important when coming to talking about healthy cities. And I would say especially in this, let's call it post-COVID time.
Yes.
I think
Air quotes.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's good to have it. I think it's extra important because, as we just talked about, open space and green space has been necessity. It's been really important for people. And how do you actually work with these recreative areas when cities are becoming more and more dense because more and more people move to the city? And I think this is where it becomes incredibly important to talk about the sound environments, because a sound environment, if it's actually poor, it can actually destroy the experience of a whole physical area. For many people, it's not totally clear it's the sound environment. But when you start studying it, it becomes clear that a sound environment is very, very subjective. People are not agreeing on whether it's a good sound environment or not. And this is where we think it's very important and interesting to look at sound environment in regards to COVID, because as we all could see in media, when we saw iconic pictures from New York and in Denmark, Copenhagen or Paris, we could see these empty streets, no traffic, no one. And everyone talked about how all the cities became silent. They were just silent. But the interesting part here is that at the same time, the cities have never received so many complaints about noise. And I think this is telling you really much about that the traditional way of measuring noise in cities are just not enough. Decibel measurements is not enough because it's about the context of a sound. It's about understanding the situation people are in. If they're working at home, all of a sudden, of course, it's like going to the countryside and it's all quiet and you hear the cow and you hear the horse and like you hear so many things because it's quiet. And I think this is what happened in the city all of a sudden. It was so quiet that you started hearing your super annoying neighbor's dog, or you started to hear like how someone was playing a computer game in the apartment underneath, and you start to hear all of these different sounds. And I think it led to so many complaining about it because people became very sensible or sensitive to it. So, and I could talk a long time about this because I'm very interested about this context part. But so the collaboration we are starting with Aarhus University, and where we had a dialogue for a while, is focusing very much on how we can create new tools where we can actually collect data that gives the citizens and the cities the opportunity to have a more nuanced dialogue. It's not about whether you turn the volume down or not. It's about how you actually create spaces, both physically, design spaces that actually creates a good sound environment. That doesn't mean a quiet sound environment. It means a good sound environment. And also this data that it's actually based on different people's experience of a sound. So this is where we come to the city at the ear level. Of course, GEHL is interested in the lived experience, and we want to hear it from the citizen's perspective. So this is what the tool will do. We see it almost like a probe you send out, or like this tool for the citizen to give us like unacknowledged data, like to tell us like, is this a good sound environment? Is this not? And then start to map and figure out like where it's calm and not calm and so on. So it's looking more at the qualitative parts of data and how you can create nuance. Again, it can't be black and white. It can't be soundbox or not soundbox, or this is a sound area and this is not. Like, but maybe it's also an answer, but it has to be more nuanced if we want diversity in a city. Otherwise, we're going to see like one age group living here and one, like we can't do it like that. So that's what we're trying to focus on.
But elaborating on this, how can we learn to perceive the sound in our cities and the sound environment, not only as this quantitative thing, which is the noise and the decibels? Because what I think right now is that it is easier for a sound researcher to kind of have this developed understanding and perception of the sound. But even me preparing for this conversation, I just immediately thought about noise.
Yeah.
And you were like, no, it's not about the noise. It's about more. But how can people who are, just experiencing city and they are maybe not even aware that they are perceiving the sound in a certain way. So how could we understand that better?
It's a super good question. It's very good because I know that the Aarhus University, they are talking very much about sonic citizenship. And they just wrote a very interesting article about it, Marie Höjlund and her colleagues. I think it's about going back to this awareness I talked about with people being behind things. I think it's about creating awareness that there are good sound environments too. Sound is not only noise. And it's not because it should be like this big thing everyone should understand. But I think if we start as urban planner to actually engage more in this and to actually use sound data or these findings, I think we can actually design good sound environments for people. And I think it's this kind of like awareness that comes through design in a way where this is a good sound environment and this is where you are calm. Like if we start to put words on it, I think we're going to get further. And if we can actually also educate cities to maybe create more nuance about it, and media, there's so many parts because the most articles I've read during COVID that has focused on sound has really been about noise complaints. And it's been about how people can't sleep because of sound boxes, and how there has just been a lot of these kind of black-white discussions. And I don't have the answer exactly how that is going to change tomorrow, but I do think that if we can collect data that actually tells more about the context of sound sources or the situation you're in, which people you're together with, whether you're working from home or not, whether you're in the park to play, like all of these things, I think we can actually unfold what sound means to people. So I think focusing on the lived experience from the citizens and trying to use that will make us better designers in urban designers. More greenery do make the sound better, for example. Like there are tools you can use, but if you don't understand the sound environments as a urban planner or a city, you won't prioritize it.
Just before we talk about the tools, I think that you said also something important out there, that we perceive the sound and the soundscape, the sound environment differently as people. Probably it also depends on our age, gender, and many other things. So who and how should be responsible for designing our soundscape? Because would you even say that, like, who could be responsible for designing the soundscape of our own apartment? In this case, it's probably we who live there that design our own soundscape in the apartment. But also, as you said, there were many complaints about the sound. So where is the limit for kind of my freedom of my soundscape, right? Because like if I'm playing on my guitar, it is creating my own sound environment and my soundscape, but my neighbor hates that.
That's true. I love your question because it's the whole dilemma with sound is that people don't agree. If you compare to other health challenges in cities like air pollution, you can measure air pollution and then that's another thing. But just measuring decibel won't solve what you're saying, like with the neighbor noise and so on. I think it's important to focus on that it's about going together, really much people. We're, of course, focusing more on public space. I know our collaborators at the Århus University are focusing very much on indoor spaces too. But I think in general, it's about this negotiation of who can make, like, understanding, like, who can make noise when. Like, there's something there that is, when is it accepted with noise and when is it good sound? And can we actually agree on some things? Like, can we find some things that we like that is a good sound? I mean, there are different sounds that are actually perceived as nice for people, like bird songs are the most classic example, or creating fontaines with water in parks is the most old concept of sound that actually keeps noise out of an area. And the more we understand these kind of like, oh, that's mapping the good sounds, then I think we can actually incorporate that much more. And to your question about who would do this, I think it has to be a collaboration. It has to be more disciplines going together. And this is, by the way, my opinion about all design. I think it should be more interdisciplinary. There's so much happening, understanding more perspectives, and especially with the cities, it's so complex today. Huge living body. We're working with a lot of sub parts, like we have to go together. So I think getting the data and trying to work with that, I think the solutions or the good sound environments then have to be in collaboration. In this case, we have the sound study department and GEHL, and we, of course, want even more collaborators on this because it's so complex. And maybe that's also one of the challenges so far, that we have actually tried to take an area like sound and to make it really simple in decibel. And I think that's the problem. Like, I think we have to unfold it and allow it to be a bit more complex to then hopefully find guidelines to actually be able to work with it.
I especially think that this part with the right to soundscape, right? And the freedom of soundscape, because like, where does my right, my law, my freedom to design my own soundscape start and where does it end? Because it will for sure influence other people. Is it my neighbors or other people using the same public space at the moment? So I think this is just a very, very interesting question. And I think that this is such a big question as well.
It's very big.
On this very general level as well. So maybe let's try to conclude in a way, what can we do with that knowledge that we have? And we also mentioned solutions, some tools. So what can be the tools that will help us to understand and design this soundscape in a better way? And what are you actually looking for in this collaboration with Århus University?
In the collaboration, we are looking at, you could say, using the 12 quality criteria we already have, looking at the physical space, and together with these sound studies. So both trying to map, like trying to gather sound, more traditional, also like trying to figure out how is this park put together sound-wise. But then we want the citizens to engage in this, to try to help us collect data. I did in my prior work, we did this project for Struer, the city of Struer, which is the city of sound, they call themselves. They took an initiative to have developed something called the Sound of Struer. And this Sound of Struer was an app where the citizen could go around and like gather sound examples from the city saying, this makes me think about this makes me do this. And that actually created this very nice map of what people found. Like, this is a good space for me. I always feel calm, and so on. So that was kind of a good example on like qualitative data on how they felt good in a city. And I think it's kind of in that direction to map it and to make the citizen actually contribute with this data. And you could say, again, we are trying to find more stakeholders to go into this because it is such an important matter. And there's the whole part of, well, if this should be truly integrated in urban planning and truly integrated into the prioritizing in the cities, it's also important to look at the standards today. There's a lot of standards on how you work with sound. It's not new to work with sound. It's just more called noise pollution. And I think getting the city, like the people responsible for noise pollution in this dialogue would also be truly interesting, because I think it would be able to make the discussion more constructive about what kind of solution we need to do. So that's where we are in our collaboration now and where we want to continue it.
So you said that we talk a lot about the air pollution, maybe also the light pollution, the sound pollution, but it's not only about the pollution, right? It's way more complex than that.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest difference. And it's almost like your brain is exploding when thinking about it, because it is such a huge area. It's really huge. And I think that's why it's hard to work with. But just to go back to why I think many people would ask, like, why is GEHL getting involved with this area? And I think to us, it's very clear that it's because it is the lived experience and because it's such a big part of a healthy neighborhood and a healthy city. And the more we focus on the local, the more we need to look at these nuances too. We need to look at both the social changes and we need to look at the visual changes, and we do need to look at the audible changes too, because it is a real threat to healthy cities. So that's why we think it is important.
Just to summarize, could one of the solutions be, if we talk about the life at the ear level, that, for example, cities will treat this challenge of sound in a more serious way by, for example, having, I just thought about it right now, what if we had some sound coordinators in our cities?
That's a good idea. Look, you already have the solution. No, I think it's a great idea. And I mentioned before, city of Struer in Denmark. It's super inspiring city. They have they have a department focusing on sound in their city. And they kind of try to incorporate it in very many of their new developments. And I think that's a really good way to do it, that it's like a premise, like when they have a project they want to have done, it has to be a premise in it that people, if it's an architect company, they have to consider the sound perspective. And I think, that's a very nice way, going in thread with what you're saying with the sound coordinator, because it is important. Then it's not only like concerts or event-based, it's about our everyday life and just not getting totally blown away by like a lot of noise or sound that is not good for us. So I think it's about using the data to make better decisions about how to treat sound in urban planning.
I just thought about it because there are many cities that are starting to have the nightlife mayors, right?
Yes, yeah.
The people who are responsible for the nightlife, but not in a way that it's only about the parties, but it's about coordinating what happens during the night.
Yeah.
So I just thought about
sound coordinator.
This for the soundscape. And just to finish on this inspiration, I just wanted to ask you for a book recommendation. Mm-hmm. Would you have any?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good books.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, exactly. There is this book that came out 2021 that is written by Sarah Williams, that is associate professor at MIT. She also has this civic design lab, data design lab that she runs, and it's called Data Action, and it's about using data for public good. So it's focusing very much on how data can actually help solve a lot of good thing for people. So it's about this, like, to create something good, you actually need to do good data, and this good data has to respect the people you work with and the data about the people. So she has some really concrete examples. Data action, it's called that because there is some action behind it. So it's not only like thinking about how it could be, but there's good project examples. So I would say for people working within the area of urban planning, architecture, societal science, like all of this, it would be a really good book to read.
So it's the same as in IT, right? If you want to have a very good end result, you need to have a very good quality data input.
Exactly. And you need to ask the right questions. I think that's going back to with the sound environments and all we talked about. I mean, it is truly about asking the right questions and to respect the outcome and think about the outcome that comes out, not in regards to shaping it, but more to say, are we treating everyone the right way when we send this out? How are we addressing all the different groups being observed or interviewed? Are we actually doing good with this? And I think it's one of the most important thing with data today, because there's so much data out there.
I hope that I managed to ask good questions today. And
you did.
And thank you for answering them.
Of course. And thank you for asking them.
Liselott, thank you very much for our conversation.
Yeah.
I know that there is a lot of things if we want to just talk about sound, but I'm really happy that we met and just started this discussion. So thank you very much.
Yeah. And big encouragement. If people are interested in this, they should absolutely contact us. We're all about collaboration. It's the only way forward.
Thank you for listening to the newest episode of Urbcast, and I hope that you enjoyed listening to my conversation with Liselott. I really learned a lot from her approach, and I also wanted to emphasize the importance of the soundscape in our cities. So maybe a small homework after listening to this episode: take your headphones out and look around and try to capture and hear the surroundings. What is the soundscape around you? Do you perceive it as a noise, or maybe it is something else? And how they influence how you feel in the place that you are currently. If you would like to get to know something more about Urbcast, you can visit my social media on Facebook, Instagram, on LinkedIn, as well as visit my website at urbcast.pl. Thank you and talk to you soon.